Time to talk about the First Sino-Japanese War, and first off a big thank you to whoever sent me this book from my Amazon wishlist. Sadly there was no information in there whom sent it to me, so I'm not sure if you intentionally stay anonymous or if there was a mistake there on Amazon's side. Anyway, thank you very much. Now first off we need to look at the underlying situation. So China was the main regional power and also the power the Japanese for a long time looked up to. But since 1850 it was basically in a decline, so there was a certain power vacuum. And usually if you have a power vacuum, other powers try to creep in. And in this instance it was the Russians with the Trans-Siberian Railroad, which was still being built, but it was getting close. And the Japanese were especially worried about Korea. Why Korea? Because Korea was basically the entry point to Japan, so both the Mongolian expeditions started from Korea and also Japanese expeditions to the mainland went also through Korea. So basically Korea was the entry and exit point to Japan. Additionally, Japan was on the rise for quite some time, whereas the Chinese were quite disdainful about the Japanese. They basically called the midget or dwarf pirates. And now you might think, well, that's not particularly nice. It's way less than nice because this was before Sid Meier's Pirates and also before Pirates of the Caribbean. So pirates weren't cool back then. So this was a real heavy insult. And the Japanese at the same time also built up the arms industry and they reformed the army. So strong focus on mobility and a strong drill on the army. And they were especially inspired by the Prussians after the victories against the French. And an additional factor is due to this Westernization of Japan, the Meiji reforms, they also needed a legitimization that these reforms actually were successful or brought more power to Japan, because there was quite for a long time a struggle inside of Japan. So this is basically the whole background and the underlying situation of the First Sino-Japanese War. Now, why did the war start? So basically this is the match, as one author referred to it, that sets everything on fire. The underlying situation, all the wood that collected so far, the dried up wood is the underlying situation. And there were several incidents in Korea and a rebellion, and Korea basically asked the Chinese and the Japanese for support, and the Chinese and Japanese also had treaties on how and how not to intervene in Korea. So both did their kind of intervention and sent troops, and then the Japanese did a surprise attack on the Chinese fleet and they sank the Cochin. So this basically started the war off. So let's look at the course of the war at sea first. There was the Battle of the Yellow Sea or Yaru River, depending on who you ask. And here basically the Japanese destroyed the main fleet of the Chinese. Now, depending on the author, there's quite some different opinions here. For instance, one author notes basically the Japanese didn't fought against an enemy fleet. They fought against several enemy formations basically because the coordination on the Chinese side was rather lackluster. The Japanese focused really on speed, and also there was the incident that the Chinese commander was leaving. Then there are also certain aspects about corruption on the Chinese side, like that they didn't have the proper powder or that guns were sold off and other stuff. Whereas several authors notes, yeah, it seems like this, but we don't certainly know that there have been some corruption or some other stuff. Some also note that the Japanese ships were quite often hit, but since there was not proper ammunition there, that the damage was rather weak. So there are different views on this, but the result was rather clear. The Chinese fleet was basically completely out of action and the Japanese only suffered minor losses. As a result, the Chinese fleet was not a threat to Japan anymore, which meant, for instance, that the Japanese could reduce their home defense and at the same time had free operations for landing operations on the Chinese mainland. So, and one instance, for instance, was the landing near Port Arthur, which the Japanese took rather easily, which brings us to the course of the war on the land side. Now, in the first week, basically, the Chinese lost Seoul without a fight, they lost the battle, and they abandoned the Korean leader. So in 1 week, they suffered tremendous moral and defeat also on the battlefield. Then the Chinese digged in around Pyongyang, but when the Japanese arrived, so they had a rather strong position, they let them cross the river and didn't attack them while they were crossing the river and while they were most vulnerable. So rather soon they got surrounded and the Chinese gave up. Then was the Yara River, the Japanese cross again and the Chinese just start running. Basically what slowed down the Japanese right now was the winter and the supply situation. The Japanese troops were mostly still equipped with sandals or not proper boots and everything. And since the supply system, the logistics were not made for a huge aerial land warfare, they suffered quite a lot. And then also the Second Army landed near Port Arthur. The Chinese suffered loss after loss after loss, and the Japanese had rather easy victories. But what finally basically broke down the Chinese or led to the final negotiations, because there were several attempts before, was the capture of Waihai, which was also a naval base. And during the negotiations, the Japanese also occupied the Pescadores Island, which were west of Taiwan. Now, if you look at the losses, it's quite interesting. Now, of course, as always, loss numbers are a bit different. Some notes there were about 1,160 men killed in action, while others note around 969. But if you look at the number of killed by disease, we're already at 3,150 almost. So as you can see, the losses from disease were likely about 3 times as much. Now the staggering number is actually the one that were affected by disease, were wounded or in other ways inflicted, and this is 57,000. As you can see, the logistical situation and everything, also the medical situation, had a huge influence. So the combat losses were rather low, but everything else was quite high. Now basically everyone was quite surprised about the Japanese winning as fast as they did and as decisively. Now why could this happen? Well, let's look first at the Chinese shortcomings. Their leader basically looked for a strategy that went for a Western intervention. Unlike many other Chinese, he probably assumed rightfully that they were no match for the Japanese. So a lot of preparations were held back. And also, yeah, he hoped basically that the West would intervene, and there were good signs for this, but it didn't happen. As a result, the Chinese were rather not well prepared. Now, usually it's alleged that they had very bad equipment, but there was one paper I read where the author basically concluded, no, that's not true. Initially, the equipment was quite good. The problem was the initial troops were rather defeated rather soon. And afterwards there was a major problem because there was a lack of standardization and the other troops were not as well equipped. But the main issue was, from his conclusion, not the equipment. There's also, you need to take a look, China is way larger, so they have more troops, but they are dispersed. What was a major problem was the unreformed officer corps. So there was a lack of training. Some soldiers didn't even know how to deal with the weaponry. And there was not enough drill. Now, not enough drill had a major problem. First off, they couldn't perform with the weapons well enough, and also the cohesion broke up rather easily. Quite often the Chinese just fled. So this was a major problem. There was no modern drill done. And another factor, of course, is, which might be a bit surprising, in many battles they were actually outnumbered. Again, the Chinese were more dispersed. They had, of course, a way larger army than the Japanese, but on the certain points, so the Japanese usually could gain local superiority in numbers, and as such, well, attacking is way easier. Of course, they were also better drilled. Now, let's also look at the Japanese shortcomings. First off, their logistics were rather bad. This was due to the situation because their logistics were all focused on homeland defense. They were not made for an invasion. Additionally, they had insufficient shipping. So there was a certain delay there. They also then rented some ships. They also needed more manpower. In total, they had around 150,000 contractors that were used for them to support the army in various aspects. There was also quite a problem here because they received extra pay when they were near the front line versus soldiers received regular pay, so there was a bit of a social trouble there. Another major problem with the Japanese was they had rather poor maps, so in some instances they assumed there would be a road or railway lines, whereas it was just a dirt track basically, which in combination with poor logistics is quite a problem. Then they suffered several epidemics and their hospitals were limited at the same time. And for instance, for the attack on Pyongyang, some author notes that this basically happened so soon because they ran out of food. So in order to keep everything going, they attacked Pyongyang and earlier as they originally planned. Another major problem was a morale drop. For instance, the Japanese had very strong regulations on speed and everything. So in training they performed very well and they meet these criteria. But then in battle, under combat conditions, they couldn't reach this. And for the Japanese, this resulted in basically a morale drop because they couldn't reach the basically theoretical or training criteria. And another drop on morale happened due to losses sustained. Now the war was concluded with the Treaty of Shimonoseki in April 1895. Basically, Korea was declared independent, so it was basically a bit more aligned to Japan than before to China, and the Chinese had to pay war reparations. Additionally, Taiwan and the Pescador Islands went to Japan. Then there were various other minor treaties like railroad concessions for Manchuria, and the Japanese also got the Liaodong Peninsula. Now several days later, Russia, Germany and France intervened. They said, okay, you have to give the Liaodong Peninsula back. This quite shocked the Japanese and it came as a realization, okay, we're a regional power, but we are still at the mercy of the West because they couldn't afford it. Now, since Russia was the main initiator of this intervention and also one of the underlying situations mentioned earlier in the video was the threat through the Russian Trans-Siberian Railroad, because Russia was seen as the main threat to Korea and not so much more any China, this laid the precedent or basically the backdrop for an upcoming war, the Russo-Japanese War in 1904 to 1905. So as you can see, everything is a bit connected here. Now, the consequences of the war are quite interesting because it actually showed how weak China was at this point. They were defeated in every battle, the Chinese navy was destroyed. As a result, various Western powers came to grab land or certain areas, which furthermore weakened China, but also meant that other powers like Japan were present in this area, in the East Asia Pacific area, which of course was not particularly in the interest of the Japanese. And as a follow-up on Taiwan, which was part of Japan now, there was a rebellion which resulted in about 700 Japanese soldiers killed in action, but also 20,000 affected by diseases. So as you can see, there was quite some impact here. And again, as you can see, diseases affect the army quite largely. Well, big thank you here to whoever sent me the book. And also thank you to Justin and Tech Error for providing additional information and giving me some hints on good sources. Also big thank you to all my Patreons. Thank you for watching and see you next time.